Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Camille Tutti, former executive editor of NextGov, longtime storyteller and podcaster. I'm excited to welcome you to our conversation today. From mandate to execution, building a modern cybersecurity strategy. The digital world has no boundaries, and neither do adversaries. As exploits become more complex, so must the methods of securing networks and preventing attacks. As such, the White House has issued executive orders and mandates to help leaders move towards zero trust architecture. But this transition is a continually evolving journey and not a destination. So, what are the key first steps federal IT decision makers must take to build zero trust into their environment and solutions? Here with me to dig into this question are CISA's TIC Program Manager, Sean Connolly, Government Accountability Office's Managing Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity, Nick Marinos, Federal Aviation Administration's Director of Solution Delivery Service for Information and Technology, Sean McIntyre, and Cribble Senior Market Strategy Manager, Jackie McGuire. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
To get us started, let's get to know each other a little bit better and go around for some brief introductions, your name, organization, and role in the mission. Then maybe take a minute or so to describe what zero trust means to you in light of the recent executive order. Why don't we start with Sean Connolly?
Yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks, Camille. So again, my name is Sean Connolly. I'm the TIC Program Manager at CISA. TIC, Trusted Internet Connections. It's really the federal architecture of how agencies are connecting together in new ways. TIC has been around since the Bush administration. It's now its third iteration. When OMB released the latest memo, I think back in 2019, the memo is really about agencies moving forward with their architectures and modernizing their environments in new flexible ways. So with TIC 3, we've really embraced the principles and tenets of zero trust in general. Then also outside the TIC program supported other CISA programs, CDM, continued diagnostic mitigation, the visibility Einstein program within CISA. And all these revolve around CISA's situational awareness mission. And outside that, I'm a co-author of NIST 800-207 Special Pub on Zero Trust. More recently, CISA's Zero Trust Maturity Model. I'm also a Tech Modernization Fund board member. And through all those different mechanisms, you hear and see zero trust. There's a general modernization push across the federal enterprise supporting these efforts. So thank you.
Nick?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for including me in the conversation. So I'm the auditor in the group here. So I take all the great best practice documents that folks like Sean pulled together. And along with my team, we go into the executive branch and take a look under the hood and see how agencies are doing in trying to better protect themselves from cyber threats. GAO, the organization that I work for as a managing director, is a nonpartisan, objective organization working for Congress to essentially perform that oversight function for anything that the taxpayer dollar is spent on, including IT and cybersecurity, which is the team that I lead. In terms of zero trust, the reality is that the underlying concepts of ZTA are not necessarily new, but the reality is that moving away from perimeter-based defenses is probably new to most organizations in the federal government. And it really is going to ultimately take quite a transformation to see it be successful. It includes not only the cooperation of senior IT leadership, but leadership in agencies in general to understand the concept, to have adequate workforce to actually be able to implement it, and then for users across the federal government to understand just what this truly means to ensure that zero trust is occurring effectively. I look forward to the conversation.
Sean McIntyre.
Thanks. Again, I'm Sean McIntyre, Director of Solution Delivery at the FAA. I have a number of enterprise services in my portfolio, including the department's Identity and Access Management Service. I'm also responsible for sustaining a large number of legacy applications that we host within the perimeter. And I have teams that facilitate the adoption of RPA, low-code, PaaS, and SaaS solutions. Application modernization is key. And our strategy is to focus across the board on solutions towards that. Of course, zero trust will play a large role in our planning in that regard.
Jackie.
Hey, so Jackie McGuire, I'm a senior market strategy manager for Cribble. And so Cribble is a company, if you're not familiar, that kind of decouples data sources from their destinations and lets you essentially take any of your data, transform it, enrich it, do anything you want to it, and send it exactly where you need to go. So my background is in data science. I was a data scientist for a SIM vendor, wrote a lot of UEBA and anomaly detection. And I think, zero trust is really all about, context and data. So at Cribble, my job is really to understand where the security industry is going and what our customers are going to need to be able to meet a lot of these regulations and requirements that they're trying to attain. So that means, bringing in all kinds of data and understanding what it means and what to do with it. So I would say that zero trust is a huge part of what I do because, again, the perimeter defense, like just assuming that once you've let somebody in, they should have free reign to do what they want, is not working anymore. So I like the more complex zero trust applications because I'm a data scientist. But yeah, it's thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Great to have you here. Sean Connolly, we just heard a few different definitions of zero trust, which is both a technical architecture and operating philosophy. I'd really like to hone in on what it means practically for an organization. Where should organizations be focusing, and what are some recommendations on an approach?
Sure. So that's a great question. We often hear from agencies, how do we begin? Nick hit on this a little while ago, where zero trust is really a lot of those first principles towards cybersecurity. And really, it's given them a common momentum or common trajectory that we may not have had before. So those first principles could be least privilege, it could be segmentation, it could be visibility. So a lot of those, again, have gone on from before zero trust was around and goes back, some of them back to Jericho Forum and earlier. But really now with zero trust, we have a common language to support them all. So when we hear from agencies, so first, each agency over the last year, they've been working with OMB and ourselves at CISA and GSA and others with their zero trust implementation plans. And so each agency, and this is typically out of the CIO shop or the CISO shop, they've designated a zero trust implementation lead. So the first thing I would suggest is if you're a mission owner or support services inside an agency, discover who is that implementation lead. They're usually the liaison, if you will, to what may be going on from the White House and the broader zero trust ecosystem across the community. With those zero trust leads, we've also been working through the zero trust implementation plans. Each agency in the spring of this year was required to send to OMB an implementation plan, and through the team at the federal CIO and federal CISO office and supporting from the USDS, the digital services team, we've been going through each individual plan, reviewing them, and then having deep dives, if you will, with each of those agencies about their plans. And there's a couple common areas. We mentioned them before. Identity, right? In the maturity or in the strategy, there is a large push, a strong push to start moving toward phishing resistant multi-factor authentication. So a lot of the questions we have with agencies is around MFA. Another common area we discuss with agencies is the requirement toward having agencies identify by next year a FISMA moderate system. And that FISMA moderate system needs to now be internet accessible. And so, again, these are discussions we've had with agencies, and really OMB's intent with that requirement is for agencies to look at new ways. I think as Jack was talking about, the point of zero trust is we have opportunities here now. So with that FISMA moderate system, migrating that to be internet accessible, maybe it needs new types of security requirements. Maybe that system has new signals. And this provides opportunities both for the NOC and the SOC to understand and to secure these environments in new ways. Thank you.
And Jackie, considering you're a data scientist, what kind of infrastructure or data does an organization need before it begins its zero trust journey? And what questions or scenarios should government leaders envision when deciding their next step in implementing a zero trust architecture?
I think the architecture question is a really good question because what I've seen often is that organizations try to implement a solution without really understanding the full scope of the problem. And so from agency to agency, from organization to organization, the actual nature of the problem you're trying to solve with zero trust is different, right? So you have some organizations that are very remote heavy. So you have lots and lots of people working from home, working remotely. You have organizations that are very device heavy. So using things like scanners and tons of endpoints that need to be protected. So I think understanding the true cyber risk assessment is starting to become a significantly more prevalent kind of goal with organizations, because you really need to understand what you're protecting. I think when Twitter had their call on the carpet before Congress, everybody was kind of shocked to learn that they didn't even know what 80% of their data was. But I don't think that's unusual. So I think doing a really good assessment of what do we have, what are we trying to protect, and how do we prioritize? To Sean's point, there are several different kind of ways you can attack zero trust. And I think understanding that balance of how many remote workers we have, what are the endpoints we're trying to protect, what are the true network threats, then you can kind of decide which of those key pieces of zero trust to start implementing first, whether it be least privilege access or segmentation. And then how you go about doing that. I think if you ask anybody who works in software, ideally we would say do everything in the cloud, right? Because truly, I mean, that's one of the best places to do these things. But the reality of on-premise architecture is not going away anytime soon. So I think also really understanding, to Sean's point, this is an opportunity. Are we just going to implement zero trust on the architecture we have, or is this an opportunity that's an inflection point to really rethink how we've structured our networks and our storage and our endpoints to make them more safe and more easy to apply this structure to?
And Nick, from a non-data scientist perspective, from GAO's perspective, what would you like to add there?
Yeah, I think I agree with where Jackie's coming from. I think you have to know what you have. So what are the data that you actually want to protect, and what does it support within your organization's mission? And that kind of helps you to prioritize ultimately then where the finite resources that an organization has can be applied for protection. A couple other thoughts that I had too were related to, again, something that Sean alluded to, the importance and the emphasis on identity verification, identity access management. That's obviously at the core of this, because in each case, if you're trusting no one from the start, then you have to be sure that no one has access to a certain piece of data or certain resource that you're trying to protect. And then ultimately, it's having an awareness then of changes to your environment, which means you have to have a really strong inventory of data, which the strategy and the subsequent guidance emphasize. And that's an area, to be perfectly honest, that our work shows that agencies continue to struggle. When you think about a lot of these federated organizations, the big departments who have, if not 100,000 employees, maybe in the tens of thousands at least, that's a lot of information that's passing along to be able to perform mission. And so if an organization is very decentralized, that can make it pretty difficult to implement ZTA effectively.
Jackie, one of the things that we hear is that zero trust is a journey. You obviously can't lift and shift your entire security stack. So what mission components, applications, and data should an organization prioritize under this new architecture framework? And to that end, as an organization achieves zero trust progress, what should it be rolling off?
Yeah, so as Nick was talking, I was actually just thinking about, so to me, people are the linchpin in zero trust, right? So typically when you can do everything you can to protect endpoints and networks and things like that, but typically human error is what causes the vast majority of the successful exploits that we see. So I think the first step is kind of taking a temperature of your organization, because the less willing people are to participate in things like multi-factor authentication and all these different methods to prohibit access to things, the more likely they are to find ways to circumvent those. So that's when you see people like giving their codes out to other people and things like that, is when I think when access becomes a frustration. So there's definitely a balance to strike there. So you need to find out kind of what the appetite in your organization is. And then there's typically some groundwork to be laid with training to educate people why this is so important, and to really do a kind of sanity check in the security team is, are we putting too many hurdles in? Is there a way to accomplish the access control we're looking for with less friction? Because I think identity access management works best when it's easy. And people are significantly less likely to either get around it or avoid using it if it's easy to use. So beyond that, I think a lot of it starts with endpoint. The endpoint is typically, if not people, the endpoint is going to be the source of a lot of your compromise, right? So I think it starts with really having a good inventory of what endpoints you have, what you're trying to protect, how you're currently protecting them. And there tends to be kind of retail therapy in security. Something happens, something goes wrong, something's not working, and we just buy another piece and put it on top of what we already have. And so I think understanding kind of what your patchwork looks like right now and where the big holes are is really important. So again, I go back to, you need to have a really, really good picture of what exactly it is you're looking at, because the vast majority of organizations don't even really have a clear view of what their cyber risk looks like. So, endpoint is always where endpoint and human education, I think will solve a huge chunk of security problems, but then really understanding what your architecture is.
Mm-hmm. Nick, earlier this year, OMB released this latest memo, 22-09, tied to Zero Trust strategy outlined in Executive Order 14028. How are mandates such as these providing useful guidance to help government leaders navigate the red tape and ensure their organization is secure?
So they are so critical, and I think you can see sort of the waterfall effect from it. So as Sean Connolly mentioned right at the early start, it's not just these directives or the priorities that are being expressed by the administration, but then the subsequent guidance that either had already been in existence and now is getting promoted more, or is going to be built upon even more to address the priorities that the administration sets forward. So I think that's important. Tone at the top. We're still waiting to see whether a national cyber strategy comes out. But it's certainly great to see the administration making a nod towards, emphasizing the importance of zero trust. The other thing that this does is at the agency level, it allows agency leaders to express the importance of having resources available to actually implement the strategy. And that can often be where the biggest barrier occurs. In order to do that, agencies need to get themselves organized, again, around cyber risk management so that they have an understanding of what they are going to prioritize first. And as Sean mentioned too, kind of test driving ZTA as a concept on one or two or multiple systems to see, what worked, what didn't work well, what information did the organization need to pass along centrally for it to be effective. But that doesn't start without, again, tone at the top occurring. So I think that's probably what's most important about these documents coming out of the White House.
Take a follow-up on that. You mentioned barriers. What do you think are the biggest barriers today to implementing Zero Trust?
Yeah, I think Jackie alluded to this as well. It's sort of the decision point that organizations have to make. If they have modernization efforts already underway and they haven't factored Zero Trust into the mix early, do they stop what they're doing to start to think about implementing, the concepts and the capabilities that would be necessary to achieve Zero Trust? And so that's difficult, right? If you're already midway through. And then there's legacy systems that aren't broken, right? That are still working properly, but will not fit well with a zero trust architecture itself. So then organizations need to also think about how they're going to modernize the entire set of legacy systems as well. And the other thing too is, despite all of this guidance being out there, we're still in the early stages of implementation. So we haven't seen how ZTA will work within small micro agencies and to the largest, maybe decentralized ones as well. So I think it's just the unknowns that may be part of the challenges too.
And Sean, I want to follow up on that and ask about your experience with hurdles. What were some of the top hurdles that you've encountered along this Zero Trust journey? Let's start with Sean McIntyre.
The hurdles are understanding what the concepts are and then how to actually implement them boots on the ground wise. The physical execution of it is something that people can't really tie to the phrasing and the discussion of zero trust as a concept right away. So I think, as Nick mentioned, sort of using proof of concepts to break that ice, I guess, is probably a good way to start.
And if you want me to follow up, Camille, two things. we also meet with our international partners, both on the vendor side and different governments. And what's interesting about the memo, and you mentioned the Cybersecurity Executive Order too, is it's really resonating across different governments. So we've had many conversations with our Five Eyes partners and some other governments just about, they're asking us, how is this working? How are the agencies supporting this? What are the challenges? Jackie was talking about the old mainframes and those types of devices. How are we supporting those? So it's really invigorated the discussions across community in new ways. We're seeing the Cloud Security Alliance, they're coming out with some new zero trust activities. So it's pretty broadly, I think, being adopted. In terms of challenge or barriers are maybe applicable, each agency is pretty unique. We talked about how zero trust is a journey or a philosophy. And so, for example, one of the requirements in the memo is toward endpoint detection and response, EDR, and having a pretty robust rollout of EDR across the agency endpoints. Some agencies have a pretty mature EDR rollout, and so it's not as applicable to them. Some agencies almost have a different variety of EDRs, and they're using this to collapse those EDRs down to have more just an enterprise type solution. Other agencies are just starting out with EDR, and this is where our CDM program can help agencies and help them, put those type of agents and solutions on those endpoints to secure them. Again, I mentioned the identity solutions, and a lot of agencies have used PIB over the years, or CAC, if you're on the DoD side. And with the release of that memo, agencies have new opportunities to consider FIDO type solutions. And really, this is the first time you've heard this from the White House about broadening adoption of identity solutions out besides PIV and CAC. And so those are discussions that are going on. And honestly, some agencies are really just double checking with us. Do you really mean we can start using FIDO2 solutions? Clear call from OMB has been yes. So we've had those discussions with agencies about where maybe PIV or CAC has not been adopted, how they can use those phishing resistant MFA solutions in new ways to secure systems. So I think those are some ways to help agencies with the barriers. Thank you.
And what's at stake if these challenges aren't addressed or overcome? I'll let you go, Sean Connery.
Well, I think a lot of this is in response to SolarWinds and just what happened out of the attack there. Of course, recognized out of just USG, the fear and recognition of ransomware attacks. And so we are setting momentum in different ways because the adversaries, continually evolving. And we talked about the challenges of perimeter security, and where before 10 years ago, the discussion more towards put your service or your device is simply behind a tick, behind a firewall stack, no matter what it was. The answer was put it behind the firewall stack. But now we're able to, and I think this is more, we mentioned cloud and how security can scale in new ways, that now we have these new opportunities to secure devices or services or user identities in new ways. So I think it's all, again, just because we recognize the adversaries advance and the momentum they have, we need to keep up and keep in front of them. And this is the clear call we have across government to move forward.
Sean McIntyre.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that all of the fundamental precursors and enablers of zero trust have value beyond zero trust. It's really just good business. And so any investment toward a zero trust end state has potential value in and of itself. Data intelligence is a key enabler, but it also makes it easier to avoid unnecessary proliferation and enables multi-use. Good API management strategy is a must, but it also enables reuse and makes possible a powerful data access and application architecture strategy. Of course, as we've mentioned, endpoints are key, and a solid, mature asset management solution provides, of course, is a precursor to zero trust, but it provides decision support for investment, control over the software that users are using that are not even related to security, and it simplifies operations and maintenance. Deep insight into your portfolio of applications is key, but it's also a necessary precursor to developing an effective rationalization and modernization strategy. And network management platforms are tried and true in their ability to reduce downtime and reduce network cost of ownership. And you can't do zero trust without one. I don't know of any of the major zero trust enabling investments that don't already have intrinsic business value, which in my opinion explains why zero trust maturity models look pretty similar to traditional IT operations maturity models.
Nick, Sean Connolly mentioned SolarWinds, which is obviously the worst case scenario. But what are some considerations in terms of security aspects that government IT leaders should think of when they decide maybe, okay, this is not that much of a priority?
Yeah, that was the wheels were spinning in my head thinking about not just SolarWinds, but other attacks that we've seen. You can even look back, 5 years ago to the Equifax attack, where a lot of times these are happening because servers are not being tracked to be properly updated. And as a result, vulnerabilities that are known are being exploited by bad guys out there, and they're able then to get in and circulate among the network to get to data that they want. So, when you go to zero trust, even more so, if the perimeter is not going to be the priority, it's going to be starting from within. If you don't know what all the assets are that you need to protect, it's those unknown assets that are going to take you down. The other thing too is that the stakes are not only high within the federal government, but within the critical infrastructure of our nation. So as DHS, CISA, as sector risk management agencies, which are those agencies that are intended to work with critical infrastructures that are largely owned and operated by private sector participants, we need to also impart the successes that we're having within the government to those that may not have the capabilities, the workforce to be able to implement some of these concepts. And if you think about the importance of zero trust in the capacity of power or other critical, areas like water treatment, places where, lives could be severely affected if a cyber attack is successful, it really emphasizes why it's so important to establish a foundation to build zero trust, principles and strategies upon.
I would love if everyone could share one piece of practical advice for our audience tuning in today. Let's start with Sean. What should people or agencies start looking to do this week to begin their zero trust journey? And what should they be looking at 6 months or 12 months from now to determine progress?
I'll go first. So as has been alluded to more than once already, zero trust is a bit of a North Star kind of journey. So I say start where you stand and just get moving in that direction. What I mean by that is review the precursors you already have that align with enabling zero trust and begin perfecting and leveraging them right now. The farther along on the journey you get, the clearer the next steps along the way will become.
Jackie.
So I'm a big Sun Tzu fan. So I think to defeat your enemy, you have to think like your enemy, right? So I was just thinking as we were talking, Nick was talking about asset inventories and things like that, how silly it is that an organization wouldn't devote time and energy to understanding exactly what's on their network, what data they hold, because that's the first thing an attacker is going to do. If an attacker gets in your network, the first thing they do is go figure out what all you have, where it sits, what's in it, what kind of data is there. So critical first step. I think thinking about zero trust is an iterative journey. I think the most important thing is to decide what is that first step. So maybe it is that inventory. Maybe it is reviewing the policies that you currently have in place regarding access management and how it's granted and revoked. But I think sometimes trying to eat the apple whole can stop organizations from taking the first bite, to use an analogy. So, zero trust is not just a journey. It's not just a journey. It's an ever evolving journey, right? Because as soon as we figure out what the best zero trust architecture is, the attackers are going to figure out the best way to exploit it. So I think getting comfortable with the fact that this is not a project that's ever going to be complete, and that there is no right step, there is just the next best step, and figuring out what that is for a specific organization.
Nick.
Those are all great points. I think I would encourage similar to the sentiment shared by Sean and Jackie. I think organizations do need to be realistic about where they are. What is their current maturity when it comes to key cybersecurity practices? Because all of those are going to be fundamental in any journey towards a zero trust architecture that can apply to an entire enterprise. So being the auditor that I am, take a look at your audit reports out of GAO, out of the inspectors general, internal assessments that you've done, especially those related to cyber risk assessments, which are going to be the honest perspectives of the organization on not only what is important to them, but what is their tolerance for risk. If you have all of that information, then when you start to pursue an implementation plan for zero trust, you're going to make sure that you aren't building upon, a rocky foundation. So I think emphasizing the importance of a solid foundation would be critical for the first, 6 to 12 months in a transformation process.
Sean.
Yeah, I think it really, one thing it depends on is your audience. So we also talk to a lot of professionals and executives and board members that, don't understand cyber, or just not their native language. So kind of what Sean was talking about, zero trust is also a way to mitigate business risk. And you have to understand how to talk to them in ways that they can appreciate what you're delivering. I think I mentioned before that I'm a tech modernization fund board member, and kind of what Sean was alluding to, if you had a Venn diagram of those two circles being modernization, zero trust, there'd be a lot of overlap there in the middle, right? There's a lot of benefits or efficiencies you can gain between them. Going back to what Nick and Jackie were just talking about, I think we all understand or can appreciate some of the technical challenges. We want to, that's where the fun is how we can do the new technical solutions. But it's really more, what are these new processes? How do we engage stakeholders in new ways? It's about collapsing some of those silos we've had. And it's really not a technical challenge as much as more a process. And I think that goes back to mentioned before, that FSMA modern system and kind of what Nick is alluding to. This is a minimal viable product, a way for agencies to learn, to move out on new ways to secure their devices. And again, it's not as much maybe about the technical solution, which of course is important, but about these teams working together in new ways to meet these common outcomes.
Yeah, we always hear when the discussion centers around zero trust that it's not a solution. You can't go and buy zero trust at the store. It goes back to what Jackie said, retail therapy, which was a nice way to put it because I can relate to that. Any quick do's and don'ts for agency IT leaders? I'll start with Nick.
I think maybe going even one level up, agency leadership really, like to Sean's point, really does have to have an understanding of what the problems are in order to be able to then make funding decisions or resource allocation decisions to actually address the issues too. So IT leaders do need to figure out what's the most effective way to communicate some of those technical issues to agency leadership that, one, may not have a long duration within an agency to actually transform it. So it is important for them to convey something that will be sustainable, because often it's going to not only, transcend administrations, but certainly CIOs and agency heads as well. So try to establish, a common set of knowledge in the organization itself so that it can carry forward regardless of who the leader is.
Jackie, do's and don'ts.
So I think one of my big don'ts is don't get too tethered to any single vendor or protocol. So in the vein of think like you're attackers, one of the reasons that like ransomware and some of the other exploits that we've seen have proliferated as quickly as they have and become as cheap as they have is because attackers are using common frameworks. They're open sourcing things. They don't put in proprietary file systems so that other hackers can't use their ransomware. So, I think one of the things that Cribble is big on is kind of vendor agnosticism. So I would encourage leaders, before you really kind of tether yourself to any single solution, to really look at open source options, to look at common schema options that are out there, because data is only as good as your ability to transform it, to manipulate it, to analyze it. So having, if you build an architecture that can't be disassembled because it's super glued together, I think you tend to have problems, and so I think one of the other big areas we see hesitance in implementing some type of new solution is that I always think of data kind of like water. And it's kind of like if you can't turn the water off in your shower and you're trying to put a new shower head on, right? Because data just keeps flowing. Data is growing at almost 25% a year. So the shameless plug for Cribble, right? One of the great things is that now that we have data pipelines that have been kind of iterated on in the last couple of years, and we've got this ability to control data, you actually now can turn the data off or fork it off somewhere else and implement some of these solutions. So I would also encourage people to explore the ways that exist to control data. Because I think that's one of the big things is if I want to cut over from one firewall to another, if I want to cut over from one, SIM to another, something like that, how do I do that without interrupting the flow of data? So really look at the tools that exist to manage your data so that you don't have those barriers to implementing new solutions.
Sean McIntyre.
Don't get paralyzed by attempting to establish a detailed start to finish plan before you start taking the first steps towards zero trust. I think we can all relate to the concept of paralysis by analysis. And I think there's a tendency towards that, especially among groups of people that don't fully understand the concept all the way.
Sean Connolly.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think going back to Sean McIntyre, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. A lot of these implementation plans, we're going to be continuing to work with agencies as these plans evolve over time. Another one, just to have everyone be aware, the CyberSats team at CISA, they've been hosting about every month or so a working group meeting. This is for agencies and the contractors that help the agencies, where we've been doing a deep dive of each of the zero trust pillars and going through the requirements that are in the OMB zero trust memo. And so each of these are pretty well attended. I think the last couple we've had is well over 500 or 700 people at some of these meetings. So resonates pretty broad across the community itself. Again, I also suggest for the agencies to reach out to their zero trust implementation leads. They usually have the awareness of what's going on across the community. Nick was talking about the agency leadership level, the federal CIO and the federal CISO council. There's a zero trust action committee led by Sylvia Burns, the CIO for FDIC. We've been meeting together for a number of years. And again, this is ways to help the leadership of those agencies to still zero trust down through their organization. So I think both bottom up and top down, we're trying to help agencies as much as we can. Thank you.
Sean McIntyre, how do you balance zero trust and data sharing between organizations?
Well, I think one of the precursors to zero trust is really having a solid understanding of what data you have, what's sensitive, what's not. And so if you take the steps as needed to implement zero trust, you can make some informed decisions about what you can release and to who.
Sean Connolly, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mentioned NIST Zero Trust Special Pub. I think right in the introduction there, it talks about how zero trust is really approach to data security and service protection. So I think going back to Jackie's point from earlier, there is that recognition that this all revolves around data. And to the question more toward partnerships, one of the publications we released recently was a draft cloud use case from the TIC program. This was released over the summer, and this meets OMB's memo or mandate toward CISA releasing different use cases. In that cloud use case, we discussed how to connect to different solutions. From that public comment period, we've heard from agencies they do want to hear more about those type of partnership connections, whether it's maybe a CSP to CSP, different agency connections. So they always want, to Jackie's point, more guidance on that. So we are looking to a position, stronger guidance to help agencies with that, because each agency, again, is different with their risk tolerance level and what they'll support. But it is recognized that there is a demand across the government for more information towards that. Thank you.
Nick, from an auditor's perspective.
Well, I think a lot of times when we talk about potential restrictions and sharing data or some of those challenges, we are often talking about personally identifiable information. We're almost at the 50th anniversary of the Privacy Act of 1974. And obviously technology has changed just a tad since the mid 70s. But the principles that are laid out in that law are very much in alignment with many of the principles of zero trust. So when you start to think about the importance of security safeguards that protect the data, you also think about some of the other practices like ensuring that there's a limited use to be expressed based on what the PII was set up front that it would be used for, that there would be a limitation on the type of collection. So you're not just sharing a trove of data with another organization, you have very specific ways with which you restrict exactly what type of data are going to actually be passed along and with what protections around them too. So I think that's another sort of fundamental piece to this, is just ensuring that, much like we've seen NIST do within its best practice documents, that you're integrating privacy into many of the questions that you're asking maybe up front in a risk assessment portion, or as Sean Connolly was pointing out too, when you start establishing interagency agreements, that you're really laying all of these things out so that nobody gets surprised when either they don't get enough data or they get way too much.
Jackie, any observations around this?
Yeah, I think it's if we look at how fast data is growing, one of the things that's become kind of a barrier is how easy it is to take data in, right? So I was just, as Nick was talking, I was thinking about how, security actually has to kind of pervade all of the IT stack in an organization. Because if you think about, people creating a new web page, I put a new web page out there for people to be able to do X, Y, Z, and all of a sudden you have this flood of data coming in, and some of it's PII. And so all of a sudden now you have sensitive data. And if there isn't a really good policy in place that says, okay, anytime we're collecting names, anytime we're collecting addresses, anytime we're collecting phone numbers, it goes to this place, it's this kind of data, it has these restrictions. I think sharing data appropriately, to Sean McIntyre's point, has a lot to do with how you categorize it. So data hygiene is something that, especially as a data scientist, I think about a lot. And data is only as good as the context you have around it and your ability to look at it. So having a really good hygiene process as data comes in and as new sources of data are created and onboarding, one, to make sure that you're not, so for example, like if you're taking in logs from something, so you're not taking in 200 lines of a log if you need 3 and paying to transfer and store all of that stuff, but also so that you really truly understand what you're dealing with. And I think there's some great tools in place now with data ingestion to kind of identify PII, say, hey, this is potentially personal information that you can start putting your databases through to see what you're sitting on. But yeah, data hygiene is a big one for me that I think about in terms of being able to effectively share data.
Well, that unfortunately brings us to the end of our time this afternoon. Thank you all for taking the time to chat with me. If you missed any segment from today's event, you'll get an email later this week with the on-demand video. I hope you share those conversations with your colleagues to continue the conversation around some of government's most complicated issues. I'm Camille Tootie. See you next time. Thank you.